Hello, dear readers. Welcome to an extraordinary journey through the dusty roads of Imperial Brazil. Today I'm going to share with you a story that transcends time, The Courage of Truth. A narrative about a brave young woman who challenged the injustices of her era, finding in the midst of adversity the strength to transform not only her own life, but the destiny of an entire community. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? What city? What country? I love getting to know our audience spread across the world, and go ahead and leave that wonderful like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our exciting stories. Year 1878, Paraíba Valley, Minas Gerais, region of the ancient gold discoveries where coffee was beginning to dominate the lands and hearts, still carried scars from a system that stubbornly resisted time. For the courage of truth. The midday sun cut like a blade across the already flayed skin of Clara Benedita Santos. Her 19 years seemed like 100 in that moment, tied to the wooden structure that formed a grotesque cross in the central courtyard of the Santa Rita plantation. The ropes had found the tender flesh of her wrists and ankles, leaving marks that bled slowly under the merciless heat of January. The chestnut hair, which in the morning still held the fragrance of herbal soap that she herself prepared, now stuck to her sweaty face, mixing with tears of pain and rebellion. Clara no longer screamed. Hours ago her vocal cords had surrendered to silence, but her eyes, large, dark as moonless nights, still carried a flame that not even the cruelty of Colonel Francisco Antonio Tavares had managed to extinguish completely. The accusation echoed in her mind like a curse: theft of gold nuggets stored in the big house, nuggets that were not just common gold, but something much more dangerous. Clara knew it, and Francisco knew that she knew. That's why the punishment transcended the usual punishment. It was a desperate attempt to break not only her body, but her soul, her will to speak. The shadows were beginning to stretch across the ground when Clara heard the sound of approaching hooves. Would it be another of the colonel's henchmen coming to check if she was still breathing? Or would it be... A solitary rider appeared on the dusty path that cut through the plantation lands, and something about that man's bearing made Clara's heart beat faster, not from fear, but from a hope she thought was dead. José Inácio de Faria adjusted the reins of his bay horse, contemplating the fork in the royal road that opened before him. At 38 years old, the colonel had learned that life's shortcuts rarely led to expected destinations, but the meeting about coffee prices at court had extended beyond what was planned, and night was approaching with the speed of summer rains. The shortcut that cut through Francisco Tavares' lands would reduce his journey by 2 hours, precious time when one has a property to manage and a godmother who worries about delays. Joaquina would surely already be on the veranda, scrutinizing the road with those eyes that seemed to see beyond the horizon. It was the silence that first caught his attention. Plantations, even during rest hours, carry their own symphony: distant lowing, workers' voices, the tinkling of utensils in the kitchen. But the Santa Rita plantation lay in morbid silence, as if the earth itself held its breath. Then José Inácio saw the crucified figure in the central courtyard. His heart contracted with familiar pain, an old wound that had never healed completely. It was as if time had rewound 15 years to that terrible morning when he found his younger sister in the same way, victim of the cruelty of men who confused power with divine right. He didn't hesitate. He dismounted from his horse with the agility of one who grew up among saddles and spurs, drawing the knife he always carried at his waist. Clara raised her eyes to him, and in that gaze José Inácio recognized something that made him tremble, the same wounded dignity that his sister had carried until the end. "Hold on a little longer," he murmured, cutting the ropes with surgical precision. "You're going to be all right." Clara collapsed in his arms like a wounded bird, and José Inácio felt the full weight of the responsibility he had just assumed. He knew that Francisco Tavares would not let this pass unpunished. But some decisions transcend fear. The San José plantation emerged from twilight like a lighthouse in the darkness, its yellowish windows spilling golden light over the carved wooden verandas. The big house, with its 2 floors crowned by red tiles that held stories of 3 generations, breathed a serenity that contrasted violently with the hell Clara had just left behind. Joaquina appeared in the doorway before José Inácio's horse came to a complete stop. At 45 years old, the woman who had raised the colonel after he lost his parents at the age of 10 still maintained the proud posture of one who had faced life with her head held high. Her experienced gaze immediately assessed the condition of the unconscious young woman in her godson's arms. "Bring her to the blue room," she said simply, as if receiving tortured young women was part of the house routine. The blue room had been refuge for his own sister, Esperanza, during her last months of life. José Inácio placed Clara on the hand-embroidered cotton quilt, watching how her breathing gradually calmed away from the terror of the cross. Joaquina worked in silence, washing the wounds with warm water infused with medicinal herbs that she herself cultivated in the back garden. Her hands, calloused by decades of work, moved with the delicacy of an artist over the injured skin of the young woman. "She's going to need time," Joaquina murmured, wrapping Clara's wrists with clean bandages. "And we're going to need courage." José Inácio nodded gravely. He knew Francisco Tavares well enough to know that the man would not accept interference without retaliation. But looking at Clara, so young, so hurt, but still carrying that indomitable flame in her gaze, he felt that some battles were worth all the risks. Night fell over the plantation like a protective mantle, but none of the 3 inhabitants of the big house managed to sleep truly. They all knew that Francisco would come. It was only a matter of time. The moon was at its zenith when the sound of multiple hooves cut through the silence of dawn like a sinister premonition. José Inácio had been awake for hours, stationed on the veranda with a cup of coffee that had grown cold between his fingers, when he saw the party materialize on the road like shadows gaining form. Francisco Antonio Tavares rode at the head of 8 armed men, his imposing silhouette outlined against the moonlight like that of a feudal lord on a punitive expedition. At 52 years old, the colonel had built his reputation on the foundations of fear and calculated violence, and his presence radiated an authority that few dared to challenge. "José Inácio!" His voice roared through the night air, laden with a rage that made the insects themselves cease their song. "I know you're there. Come out." José Inácio set the cup on the veranda sideboard, smoothed the graying moustache that was beginning to betray his age, and descended the steps with the tranquility of one who had made an irrevocable decision. Behind him, through the half-open window of the blue room, Clara watched the scene with her heart racing. "Francisco," José Inácio greeted, stopping 3 meters from the group. "It's late for social visits. Give me back what's mine." Francisco dismounted with a brusque movement, his right hand resting significantly on the revolver grip. "The woman, she stole gold from my property and must pay for it." "The woman has a name," José Inácio replied calmly, "and she's under my protection." The silence that followed was dense as molasses, charged with all the tension accumulated between 2 men who represented diametrically opposed visions of power and humanity. Francisco's henchmen moved imperceptibly, but José Inácio remained motionless like a centennial tree. "You have no idea what you're doing," Francisco's voice lowered to a threatening whisper. "That woman knows things that can destroy powerful men." It was then that Clara appeared on the veranda. Wrapped in a white robe that Joaquina had provided, still displaying the bandages on her wrists like war scars, she raised her chin with a dignity that made all present hold their breath. "Leave him alone," she said, and her voice, though hoarse from suffering, carried a firmness that surprised even José Inácio himself. "I'll go with you." But it was at that moment that Clara understood something fundamental. The time had come to speak the truth. "No." Clara descended the veranda steps with measured paces, each movement a declaration of war against the fear that had governed her life in recent months. "I'm no longer going to run from the truth." Francisco Tavares felt something icy settle in his stomach. For 4 months he had slept poorly, always waiting for this moment, when the secrets buried in the old Dry Creek mine would finally come to light like vengeful spirits. "Francisco!" Clara spoke his name as if it were a curse, and her voice echoed in the silent night with the authority of one who had faced death and discovered there was nothing left to fear. "Tell Colonel José Inácio about the gold I stole. Tell him about the nuggets that didn't come from your land, but from the Imperial Mint." Francisco's face paled under the moonlight, and José Inácio felt a terrible understanding settling in his mind. "Continue," said José Inácio, his voice low but charged with an authority that made Francisco's own henchmen instinctively retreat. Clara breathed deeply, feeling the weight of 4 months of forced silence finally dissipating from her shoulders. "I was cleaning the library of the big house when I heard voices in the office," she began, and each word was like a stone thrown into a mirrored lake, creating waves that spread infinitely. Francisco was with a well-dressed man who spoke about gold shipments destined for the court, about irregularities that needed to be silenced. The silence was deafening, Even the crickets seemed to have ceased their nocturnal music to hear the revelation that would change everything. "The man called himself Inspector of the Imperial Mint," Clara continued, and Francisco made a movement as if to interrupt her. But José Inácio stepped forward, his presence an insurmountable barrier. He had discovered that Francisco diverted gold destined for the imperial coffers, substituting it with common ore. When he threatened to denounce him, Clara closed her eyes for a moment, reliving the scene that had haunted her since September. Francisco poisoned him, right there in front of me, and then he buried the body in the abandoned Dry Creek mine. The world seemed to stop. Francisco had paled so much that he looked like a ghost under the moonlight, and his henchmen exchanged worried glances. Murdering a crown official was treason, a crime punishable by death. But Clara wasn't finished. "The nuggets I took weren't stolen," she said finally. "They were the evidence I kept to prove that Francisco Antonio Tavares is a murderer and a traitor to the empire." Dawn came with an unexpected party. Dr. Tomás Ribeiro de Silva, judge of law of the comarca, rode at the head of 6 imperial soldiers, his presence lending an almost religious solemnity to the morning that dawned over the São José plantation. José Inácio had dispatched his most trusted foreman still in the early hours, right after Clara's revelation, with an urgent letter to the authorities. He had known Tomás for more than a decade. They were from the same generation, had studied together at the seminary of Mariana, before life led them down different paths. If there was a man in the entire comarca who could be trusted to make justice prevail over political conveniences, that man was Tomás. The magistrate, at 58 years old, carried the austere dignity of one who had dedicated his life to the service of law. His completely white hair contrasted with eyes still alive and penetrating, capable of discerning truth through the thickest layers of lies and subterfuge. "Francisco," said Tomás, dismounting with the gravity of one who carries the weight of the empire on his shoulders, "are you aware of the accusations that weigh against you?" Francisco had spent the last hours of dawn in a state of growing agitation, sending his henchmen away and trying to formulate a defense for the indefensible. Now before imperial authority, his usual arrogance gave way to a poorly disguised nervousness. "They're lies from a fugitive slave," he tried, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. "This woman is known for her fertile imagination." Clara was on the veranda beside Joaquina, observing the scene with a serenity that surprised everyone. After months carrying that terrible secret alone, there was an almost physical liberation in finally having the truth exposed to the light of day. "Young woman," Tomás addressed her directly, his voice gentle but imbued with authority, "are you willing to repeat your accusations under oath?" "I am." Clara descended the steps, and for the first time in months, her steps carried no fear. "And I'm willing to show exactly where the body is buried." Tomás nodded gravely. "Then we'll go there now." Francisco tried one last argument. "Tomás, you've known me for years. I'm a respected man in this region, faithful contributor to the imperial coffers. Are you going to believe the fantasies of a—" "I'm going to believe the evidence," Tomás cut him off. "And if the evidence confirms the accusations, Francisco, not even your social position will be able to save you." The party headed to the abandoned Dry Creek mine under the increasingly intense morning sun, carrying with them the weight of a truth that was about to shake the foundations of that entire community. Clara rode beside José Inácio, and for the first time since September, she felt she was no longer alone. The abandoned Dry Creek mine lay like an open wound in the mining landscape, its galleries excavated decades before by the bandeirantes in search of gold that had made the glory and disgrace of Minas Gerais. Now, under the relentless midday sun, it guarded secrets much more sinister than forgotten nuggets. Clara pointed to a specific place, near the main entrance of the mine, where the earth seemed slightly softer than the surrounding soil. "There," she said simply, and her voice echoed off the rocky walls like a final judgment. The soldiers worked in silence, their shovels cutting the earth with military precision. Francisco watched the excavation with growing desperation, his hands trembling imperceptibly, a tremor that did not escape the experienced eyes of Tomás. Joaquina had insisted on accompanying the party, claiming that Clara needed feminine support in that crucial moment. In truth, the experienced woman recognized a historical moment when she saw one, and knew that her presence as a witness could be decisive. It was when one soldier's shovel produced a different sound, no longer the clean cut of earth, but the hollow touch of metal against something solid, that everyone held their breath. First emerged the bones, then the remains of quality clothing, fine fabric that only men of position wore. But it was the personal objects that transformed suspicions into certainties. A gold ring with the imperial coat of arms engraved, and more importantly, a leather briefcase containing official documents written in Latin with the seals of the imperial mint. "Good God," murmured Tomás, examining the documents. Even partially deteriorated by moisture, it was possible to identify reports about irregularities in the processing of gold destined for the imperial coffers, all signed by the Inspector General of the Imperial Mint. Francisco tried one last move. "That proves nothing. Anyone could have buried those objects there to—" "Francisco," Tomás's voice now carried all the authority of the Empire, "you are under arrest for murder of an imperial official and treason to the crown." But there was still more evidence to discover. Back at the Santa Rita plantation, a thorough search of Francisco's safe revealed gold bars with the official marks of the Imperial Mint. Gold that should be in the imperial coffers at court, not in the hands of a coffee planter. Clara observed Francisco's arrest with a strange sensation. It wasn't triumph she felt, not even relief. It was something deeper, the restoration of an order that had been violently broken 4 months ago. José Inácio approached her when the soldiers took Francisco away in handcuffs. "It's over," he said simply. But Clara knew that in truth, everything was just beginning. 4 weeks passed since Francisco Tavares's arrest, and Ouro Preto boiled with rumors that ran through the cobblestone streets like storm water. The news that one of the most powerful colonels in the region had been arrested for murder and treason had spread throughout the province, dividing opinions and awakening fears. Clara had definitely established herself at the São José plantation, working alongside Joaquina in domestic administration while awaiting developments in the case. Her physical wounds had healed, but she perceived that the emotional scars would take much longer to heal completely. It was on a February morning, while Clara helped Joaquina prepare preserves for winter, that José Inácio returned from Ouro Preto with a somber expression on his face. "Lawyers from the capital have arrived," he announced without preamble, his voice laden with concern. "Expensive men, hired by gold merchants who have business with Francisco. They claim that the entire accusation is a conspiracy to destroy the reputation of an honored man." Clara felt her blood freeze in her veins. For weeks, she had enjoyed a false sense of security, believing that truth, once revealed, would be sufficient to guarantee justice. Now she understood how naive she had been. "What kind of conspiracy?" asked Joaquina, always practical. José Inácio sighed deeply before responding. "They claim that Clara and I plotted together to incriminate Francisco, motivated by a dispute over land. They say I planted the evidence in the mine and that Clara was instructed to lie in exchange for protection and other favors." The silence that followed was heavy as lead. Clara immediately understood the implications. Not only was her credibility being attacked, but her very morality was being questioned in a way that would destroy any possibility of being taken seriously as a witness. "There's more," José Inácio continued. "The case has been transferred to a higher court. Magistrate Manuel Augusto Ferreira will preside over the trial. He's a just man, but also cautious. He won't condemn anyone without absolutely irrefutable evidence." Clara slowly rose from the table where she was peeling fruit, her hands still trembling slightly, not from fear, but from a cold and controlled rage that was growing in her chest. "Then we need more evidence," she said with a determination that surprised even herself. If Francisco acted once, he certainly acted other times. Men like him leave trails of blood wherever they pass. It was at that moment that Joaquina, who had remained silent, spoke for the first time. "I know a widow in Barbacena. She lost her husband 2 years ago under strange circumstances. He was a miner, had discovered something on Francisco's lands." Clara and José Inácio exchanged glances. The battle was far from over, but now they had a direction. Truth, they understood, was like gold, too precious to be found on the surface. It was necessary to dig deep, very deep, to bring it to light. The strategy was simple but dangerous. Travel throughout the region in search of other victims of Francisco Tavares's cruelty. José Inácio knew the comarca like few others, and in the following months he transformed into a kind of itinerant investigator, always accompanied by Clara, whose presence encouraged other women to speak. The first witness was found in Barbacena, exactly as Joaquina had suggested. Dona Emerenciana, a 40-year-old widow, received them in her modest house with an initial distrust that gradually transformed into relief when she realized that finally someone was willing to listen to her story. "My Antonio found a rich vein in the lands we rented from Francisco," she told them, her rough hands trembling over the coffee cup. "When he went to report the discovery, as the contract required, Francisco said he was lying. 3 days later, Antonio was found dead in the river with signs of blows to the head." Clara took the widow's hands, recognizing in her the same helplessness she had felt months before. "Did you try to report it?" "I tried, yes. But who was going to believe a poor widow against the richest colonel in the region? The delegate said that Antonio had drunk too much and fallen into the river by accident. But Donna Emerenciana was not the only one. In Juiz de Fora, they found a miner who had been brutally beaten for discovering that Francisco adulterated the purity of the gold he bought from small prospectors. In São João del Rei, an entire family had been expelled from their lands after the patriarch questioned the colonel's debt collection methods. The most touching case was that of Father Nicolau, found in a distant parish where he had been transferred after publicly questioning Francisco's methods during a Sunday sermon. The religious man, 70 years old with eyes still alive and determined, did not hesitate to join the party heading to Ouro Preto. "For 20 years I've been trying to alert the authorities about that man's practices," said the priest, his voice tremulous but firm. "If there's now a chance to do justice, I will spare no effort." It took 6 weeks to gather all the witnesses, 25 in total, representing 2 decades of systematized violence. José Inácio personally financed the transport and lodging of all, investing a considerable amount of his resources in the cause of justice. On the eve of departure for Ouro Preto, Clara found herself alone in the garden of the São José plantation, contemplating the stars that twinkled like diamonds in the mining sky. José Inácio approached silently, respecting her moment of reflection. "Are you afraid?" he asked gently. Clara considered the question before answering. "Not anymore. For months I was afraid to speak, afraid of not being believed, afraid of dying. Now I realize there's something worse than fear, cowardice. And I'm not going to be a coward." José Inácio felt something move in his chest, a deep admiration for that young woman he had found tortured, and who had now transformed into a force of nature, capable of mobilizing an entire region in the name of justice. Tomorrow, truth would be put to the test in the most important tribunal of the province. And Clara would be ready. The tribunal of Ouro Preto had never witnessed a hearing like that one. Magistrate Manuel Augusto Ferreira, a magistrate of impeccable reputation and almost military rigor, presided over the session in a room that barely contained all the people involved in the process. 25 witnesses occupied the benches reserved for the public, while a team of 5 lawyers defended Francisco with the fervor of those who charge astronomical fees. Clara occupied the main witness bench, wearing a dark blue dress that Joaquina had sewn especially for the occasion. Her hands, which months before had trembled with fear, now rested calmly on her lap as she observed the unfolding of events with a serenity that impressed all present. Francisco, seated on the defendant's bench, had lost much weight during the months of imprisonment. His hair, always impeccably combed before, now showed disheveled grayish strands, and his eyes carried the weariness of one who knows the battle is lost but still fights out of pride. Dr. Augusto Mendes, the defense's main lawyer, was a corpulent, middle-aged man, known for his ability to transform guilty parties into victims through his persuasive oratory. His strategy was predictable: demoralize Clara and present the evidence as an elaborate conspiracy. "Your Honor," he addressed the magistrate with calculated theatricality, "what we have here is not a case of justice, but a sordid plot orchestrated by individuals who intend to destroy an honored man for purely financial motives." But it was when Clara was called to testify that the atmosphere of the room completely changed. Her voice, clear and firm, echoed off the stone walls with the authority of one who had faced death and discovered that truth was stronger than any fear. She narrated every detail of that terrible September afternoon: the voices in the office, the poison poured into the wine chalice, the body being carried to the abandoned mine. She spoke without hesitating, without stumbling over words, looking directly into the magistrate's eyes. Dr. Mendes tried to destroy her credibility. "Young woman, do you admit that you were stealing when you witnessed those supposed events?" "I was cleaning the library," Clara corrected calmly. "It was part of my job, and I didn't witness supposed events. I witnessed a murder." It was then that Joaquina was called to testify, and her final revelation shook the entire tribunal. 12 years ago, she said, with the firm voice of one who had kept secrets for too long. "My cousin Benedito was murdered by Francisco Tavares. Benedito had discovered a rich gold vein in the lands that Francisco illegally leased from the crown. When he tried to report, the room exploded in murmurs. Joaquina was revealing that Francisco not only killed out of greed, but also out of fear of having his frauds discovered. The magistrate struck his gavel, restoring silence, but the damage was done. The pattern was clear. Francisco Tavares was a serial criminal who for decades had used violence to protect his illicit business. When the session was closed for deliberation, Clara knew that truth had finally found its voice. Magistrate Manuel Augusto Ferreira took only 2 hours to deliberate, record time for a case of such complexity. When he returned to the room, his grave countenance left no doubt about the decision he had made. Francisco Antonio Tavares, his voice echoed through the packed room like the roar of distant thunder, for murder of an imperial official, treason to the crown, and multiple crimes against citizens of this comarca. This tribunal sentences you to life imprisonment with forced labor in the imperial mines of Villa Rica. A sepulchral silence took hold of the environment for a few seconds, followed by an explosion of voices and emotions. Francisco collapsed in his chair like a rag doll, while his lawyers tried to process the magnitude of defeat. Life imprisonment in the imperial mines was almost a death sentence. Few men survived more than 5 years in the inhuman conditions of those tunnels. Clara felt tears run down her face, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, of justice finally done, of an immense weight being removed from her shoulders after months of agony. José Inácio approached her when the crowd began to disperse, and for the first time since they met, he allowed himself to gently touch her arm in a gesture of congratulation. "You did it," he said simply, but his words carried all the pride and admiration he felt for that extraordinary young woman. The witnesses who had traveled from throughout the comarca embraced Clara one by one. Donna Emerenciana wept openly, finally seeing justice for her husband's death. Father Nicolau whispered a blessing in Latin over her head. Each person Francisco had hurt over the years found in that moment a kind of collective healing. The return journey to the São José plantation was festive. José Inácio had chartered carriages to transport all the witnesses back to their cities, and throughout the journey, songs and laughter could be heard, the sound of hope being restored in hearts that had lost faith in justice. Upon arriving at the plantation, Joaquina had prepared a banquet with the best products of the property. Under the stars of a clear March night, 27 people, the 25 witnesses, plus Clara and José Inácio, toasted not only Francisco's conviction, but the proof that truth, when defended with courage, always prevails. Clara looked around the table, seeing faces that reflected decades of suffering finally finding peace, and knew that her life had found a purpose greater than she had ever imagined possible. The journey that began with torture and humiliation had transformed into an epic of collective redemption. 6 months passed since the trial, and the São José plantation breathed a renewed tranquility. The September rains had been generous, promising an extraordinary coffee harvest, and Clara discovered that life could be much more than survival. It could be growth, learning, even happiness. Joaquina had assumed the role of teacher with the enthusiasm of one who had finally found a purpose for the knowledge accumulated in decades of reading during free hours. Every morning after domestic tasks, Clara sat in the big house library, the same library she once cleaned as a servant, to learn to read, write, and do accounts. "Education," said Joaquina, while guiding Clara's pen over the paper, "is the only wealth that no one can steal from you." José Inácio observed Clara's progress with a mixture of admiration and something deeper that he still didn't know how to name. The 19-year-old young woman he had found tortured had transformed into a woman of striking presence, capable of managing the domestic aspects of the plantation with impressive efficiency and still finding time to correspond with other women from the region who sought her guidance on legal matters. It was on an October afternoon, while Clara reviewed the property's account books, that José Inácio made a decision that had been maturing for weeks. "Clara," he said, entering the library with steps somewhat more hesitant than usual, "I need to talk to you about the future." She raised her eyes from the numbers, perceiving something different in his tone. "What kind of future?" José Inácio approached the desk where she worked, but remained standing, hands clasped behind his back, in a posture that betrayed nervousness. "You're free to leave whenever you want," he began. Your debt to me, if such a debt ever existed, was paid long ago, but I would like to propose an alternative. Clara slowly closed the account book, paying full attention to his words. Marriage, said José Inácio finally, the word coming out like a sigh. A marriage based on mutual respect, companionship, and, who knows, with time, something deeper. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. Clara had learned to value silences. They allowed thoughts to find their true form before transforming into words. Why? She asked simply. José Inácio smiled, and for the first time Clara perceived how his smile completely transformed his face, revealing a vulnerability he kept carefully hidden from the world. Because in 6 months you've become essential to this house, to this property, to me, because I admire your courage, your intelligence, your compassion, and because I believe that together we can build something better than either of us could achieve alone. Clara stood up, walking to the window that overlooked the coffee plantations. The coffee plants extended to the horizon, gently undulating in the afternoon breeze like a green and golden sea. And the plantation slaves? She asked finally. The question caught José Inácio by surprise. How so? If I marry you, we'll be united not only as husband and wife, but as administrators of this property, and I can't be part of a system that I myself experienced firsthand. José Inácio immediately understood what she was proposing. Gradual liberation? Gradual liberation, Clara confirmed, with land for those who want to stay, education for children, fair wages for workers. A transformation that honors both our convictions and the economic needs of the plantation. José Inácio approached her at the window, standing side by side as they contemplated the lands they would soon administer together. I accept, he said, both the proposal and the conditions. Clara smiled, and José Inácio realized it was the first time he had seen her truly smile since he had known her. Then I accept too. The wedding was set for December, but before preparations could begin, an unexpected discovery would forever change Clara's understanding of her own history. Joaquina was organizing the personal belongings that Clara had left at the Santa Rita plantation, objects that José Inácio had managed to recover after Francisco's arrest, when she found a yellowed letter sewn into the lining of an old dress, a letter that Clara had never seen before. "Child," Joaquina called her with a trembling voice, holding the paper with fingers that trembled slightly. "You need to see this." The letter was written in delicate, feminine handwriting and dated 18 years before, just 1 year after Clara's birth. As she read, the world around her seemed to spin at a vertiginous speed. "My dear daughter, if you are reading this letter, then you grew up away from me as I feared would happen. My name is Isabel Benedita Santos, and I was your mother. I was forced to give you up when you were still a baby, because I discovered secrets that put our lives in danger. The man who forced me to silence is powerful and cruel, capable of anything to protect his crimes. His name is Francisco Antonio Tavares." Clara had to sit down, her legs failing under the weight of the revelation. The letter continued. "Francisco murdered my husband, your father, when he discovered that he had found compromising documents about imperial gold diversion. I tried to report him, but he threatened your life, my dear daughter. He said that if I spoke anything, you would die. So I fled, leaving you with people I hoped would raise you with love and security." Clara's hands trembled so much she could barely hold the paper. Joaquina sat beside her, putting a protective arm over her shoulders. "If something happened to me and you're reading this already grown up, know that every day away from you was torture worse than any physical punishment. But also know that you carry the blood of brave people, people who didn't bow to injustice. Your father died defending what was right. I hope you inherited his courage." The letter ended with information that made Clara's heart almost stop. There are evidences hidden in the old Dry Creek mine, documents that prove all of Francisco's crimes. If someday you are brave enough to face him, they will be there waiting. Your mother who loves you forever, Isabel. Clara looked at Joaquina with wide eyes. She knew. My mother knew about the mine, about the documents. She died trying to protect evidence I didn't even know existed. "And you," said Joaquina softly, "unconsciously followed her steps. You found the evidence she hid, faced the man who destroyed her, and did the justice she never could do." It was then that Clara understood the complete dimension of her journey. It hadn't been coincidence to be in the library that September afternoon. It hadn't been chance to witness the inspector's murder. It was as if her mother's spirit had guided her through 18 years of separation to complete the mission that had begun decades before. José Inácio found the two women embraced in the library, crying tears of pain and relief simultaneously. When Clara showed him the letter, he understood that the young woman he had fallen in love with was even more extraordinary than he had imagined. "Now I understand," he said softly, "where your courage comes from. It runs in your veins for generations." Clara wiped her eyes and stood up, feeling transformed by the discovery. She was no longer just Clara Benedita Santos, the young woman who had survived torture. She was Clara Benedita Santos, daughter of Isabel and granddaughter of a lineage of people who didn't bow to injustice. And that discovery would change not only how she saw the past, but how she would face the future. December 1878. The wedding ceremony was celebrated in the chapel of the São José plantation under a cloudless blue sky that seemed to bless the union. Father Nicolau, who had remained in the region after the trial to help with the social transition that was beginning, conducted the ceremony with the solemnity and joy of one who witnessed not only the union of two people, but the beginning of a new era. Clara wore the wedding dress that had belonged to José Inácio's mother, adapted by Joaquina, with delicate lace that transformed the young woman into a vision of serene elegance. José Inácio, at 38 years old, discovered that it was possible to restart life when one found the right person to share it with. Among the guests were many of the witnesses who had participated in the trial. Donna Emerenciana had traveled from Barbacena especially for the occasion, saying she wouldn't miss the most important wedding in the region for anything in this world. But the most exciting moment of the ceremony was not the exchange of vows, but the announcement that José Inácio made after the final blessing. "Friends," he said, addressing those present, "Clara and I would like to share with you our first decision as a couple. Starting in January 1879, the São José plantation will initiate a process of gradual liberation of all enslaved workers, offering them paid work contracts, land parcels for their own cultivation, and education for their families." The announcement was received with enthusiastic applause, but Clara knew that those words represented much more than an administrative change. They represented the transformation of an entire society, a small silent revolution that began there but whose echoes would spread throughout the region. 5 years later, 1883, Clara was on the veranda of the big house, watching the children play in the garden while reading a letter that had just arrived from the capital. At 24 years old, she had become one of the most respected women in the region, sought after by other plantations that wished to implement similar processes of transition to free labor. The letter was from an association of working women from Rio de Janeiro, inviting her to speak at a congress about the rights of domestic workers. Clara smiled as she read the invitation. Who would have thought that the young woman tortured on a wooden cross would become a respected voice in the fight for social justice? José Inácio approached, carrying their 2-year-old son, José Benedito, a name chosen to honor both the father and the grandmother Clara had never known personally, but whose legacy she carried in her heart. "Another letter from the capital?" he asked, sitting beside his wife. "They want me to speak about our experience with the transition to free labor," Clara responded, carefully folding the correspondence. "And about women workers' rights." José Inácio smiled. In the 5 years of marriage, he had seen Clara transform into a natural leader, sought after by people from throughout the province, who sought guidance on legal and social matters. The plantation library had become an informal center of popular education, where Clara taught reading and writing to children and adults from the region. "Are you going to accept the invitation?" Clara looked toward the garden where the children, sons of former slaves, now free workers of the plantation, played alongside her own son. She thought of her mother's letter, of the words about courage inherited through generations, of the example she wanted to leave for José Benedito. "I'm going," she decided, "but I'm not going alone. Joaquina comes with me. She has as much to teach as I do." Joaquina, at 50 years old, had become the coordinator of the plantation's education program, teaching dozens of children and adults to read and write. Her experience and wisdom were sought after by educators from other regions. That night, as Clara put her son to bed, she whispered to him the same promise she had made to herself years before. "You're going to grow up in a better world, my son. A world where no one will be tied to a cross for speaking the truth, where courage will be rewarded and justice will prevail." José Benedito fell asleep in his mother's arms, and Clara knew that her own mother's legacy, Isabel, would continue through him. The courage of truth would pass to another generation, ensuring that the lessons learned on that plantation in Minas Gerais would echo through time. Outside, under the stars that shone over the free coffee plantations, Joaquina softly played her guitar on the veranda, singing an old song that spoke of conquered freedom and realized dreams. The music spread through the mining night like a prayer of gratitude, carrying with it the promise that truth, when defended with courage, always finds its way to the light. Clara fell asleep that night, knowing that her story, the story of a young woman who found courage in the depths of suffering and transformed pain into strength, injustice into social change, would continue to inspire other people far beyond her time. And so in the red lands of Minas Gerais, under the infinite sky of imperial Brazil, the courage of truth wrote another chapter in humanity's long struggle for dignity, justice, and hope.